Last time I put a bunch of business cards with the pictures of Tikal down here. I put them up there this time so people upstairs can have a few as well if you're interested. And today we're going to talk about African encounters with Europeans. And you've been looking at this chart for a few minutes, and I want you to look at it again and tell me later what is missing. All right, we're going to return back to this chart toward the end to see what is missing. But I would like to just point out as an aside that the word slave comes from the Latin word esclavo, and that is a word applied to Slavs. Slavic peoples, because they were the source of slaves before Africa was found and discovered by the Europeans. Most of the slaves were coming from the Slavic countries. And that is, I am 3/4 Slav, and the rest is Greek. All right, so we're going to talk about the encounters, the exchange of ideas and people between Africa and the rest of the world once Africa was discovered and explored. And there are various areas of exchange. We have cultural exchange, and that's the arts, and we're going to talk about, I have a whole lecture on the arts, on masks, voodoo, religion, etc., and I believe that might be the next lecture. We have a biological exchange, which is the agricultural goods, maize, yams, peppers, and invasive plants. Invasive plants are a problem. They're a problem across the New World. They're a problem across the world because oftentimes invasive plants tend to be hardier than domesticated plants. The third exchange, the third encounter, is political, and that has to do with rights, wars, and reform. And the fourth encounter is developmental. What is the cause of the continued underdevelopment and poverty that plagues Africa? And all of that is something that we are going to talk about. Why did Europe go westward? We need to look back at European history to find out why the Europeans so aggressively went after Africa in the 15th century. Well, first of all, Constantinople fell in 1453, and the fall of Constantinople reverberated all through Europe. In fact, it was the fall of Constantinople and the Ottoman pressure on the eastern part of the Mediterranean that spurred the Renaissance. Had Constantinople not fallen, had Mehmed II not succeeded in conquering Constantinople, we may not have had a Renaissance in the way that we see the Renaissance, and we may not have had the knowledge rediscovered, this knowledge that the ancients had collected and put into books. And that is all part of the fall of Constantinople. What happened when Constantinople fell? Well, the Silk Roads were closed to the Western Europeans. And the Silk Roads, there was more than one, there were a number of Silk Roads. They were Western Europeans' access to spices, to silks, and to riches and trade in the East, and particularly in India and in Indonesia. And it was an overland trade up until that time. But the Ottomans closed off the West, the East to the West, and the Europeans were stuck without spices. Now, what do you do without spices? You think, oh, well, you can live without spices, right? Well, without refrigeration, food didn't taste too good after a couple of days in the larder. It smelled. And basically, spices slowed down the deterioration of foods and increased the flavors of the foods. And this, in the yellow-green, is what the Ottomans took from the Europeans and from the old, what was left of the old Roman Empire. They closed that off. That's the Ottoman Empire in 1580. Now, Africa was known before. Of course, they traded with Africa. It is even thought that ancient peoples, the Phoenicians in particular, who were master sailors from around 800 BC, had circumnavigated Africa. We don't know for sure, but there's a series of maps. This is one of them. This is a map of Africa that is copied from Ptolemy's map. The Ptolemies were the rulers, the Greek rulers of Egypt, up until the time of Cleopatra and Caesar. And they were Ptolemy was one of the generals of Alexander, and who is called the Great. Alexander, when he died at the age of 33, had 5 generals or so who separated then from his main army, and each of them took a portion of the world that they had explored and conquered, and Ptolemy got Egypt. Ptolemies, then there were 300 years or so of Ptolemies. They all took the same name. They all used the Egyptian system of intermarrying brothers and sisters. So Cleopatra was the descendant of brothers and sisters. She was married to her brother before she went with Antony and before she had a love affair with Caesar as well. But one of her ancestors was a scientific man, and he drew maps of the world, and several of his maps are in existence because they were remade in the 14th and 15th century during the early Renaissance. This is one of them. It's kind of hard to figure out where we are, but from that it looks like, see the Mediterranean up to the north, and it looks like he understood that Africa could be circumnavigated and was at some point circumnavigated. This was Claudius Ptolemy, and the map dates to 150 years before the Christian era. However, that knowledge in time was lost, and it was not rediscovered until after the fall of Constantinople. When Constantinople fell, the pressure to go to the east had continued, and the Spaniards and the Portuguese then decided that they were going to go westward in order to get to the east. Now, everybody knew that the earth was round. There was no question about that the earth was flat. Eratosthenes in 280 BC of Alexandria had actually calculated the circumference of the earth within 3% or 1.5%, depending on what the size of the Roman unit of measurement was, which he didn't explain which unit of measurement he used. So they were then forced to look for a way to go to the east to continue the trade if they wanted to continue and find silks. The problem going around Africa, and the Portuguese were the first to start to go around Africa and to head toward the east, and they decided that they would head toward the east by heading south and going around the southern tip of Africa, which they weren't quite sure what was there. The Spaniards worked on this a little bit later, because the Spaniards were involved at that time in fighting the Moors in Granada. Granada was the last holdout of the Moors, and Isabella was herself leading the military against the Moors in Granada. And when Granada fell in 1492, there was a young man in the ceremony when she took the keys to the city, and his name was Christopher Columbus. And then she turned her military and her interest toward finding the east by going to the west. But the Portuguese were first. They started this earlier. The problem was they had already started several voyages around Africa, but the problem was these currents that are in the Atlantic Ocean. They weren't sure when they sailed around to the south whether they'd get swept out toward the west or not. Now, they didn't know there was a continent there. They didn't know the Americas were there. They just knew that the earth was round, and that if you kept on going, you would eventually get to India and to the Spice Islands, but they didn't know what they would find along the way. And so it was a slow process, going little by little around the bottom or the southern part of Africa. And as they went along, they set up trade centers, and they explored the area, and they reported it back to Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry the Navigator was a younger son of the King of Portugal, and the King of Portugal told him he could not get involved in business, and he wasn't allowed to do anything practical, so he set up a school of navigation. It was a very secretive school. He didn't want the knowledge to be distributed, but he sponsored these explorations along the African coast. And he himself went to the Cape Verdes and to some of the islands. And at this time, what was happening in the Arab world was that they were recreating and rediscovering the ancient Greek and ancient Mediterranean knowledge. And among other things that they discovered and rediscovered and improved was the astrolabe. And the astrolabe then got across the Mediterranean and got to Spain, to Portugal, and from Portugal it got to England. And actually, had it not been for the astrolabe and for some of this technology, it would never have the areas, the explorations would never have been as successful as they were. So the astrolabe was important in that it could tell latitude. They could tell where they were north and south in relation to the equator. They could not tell where they were east and west. Longitude escaped the science until about the 18th century, until they could figure out, and they could do it with clocks, and that's where Greenwich Mean Time comes in. When they started the voyages of exploration along the African coast, they slowly crept on down. The Portuguese had a ship. Their ship was called the Caravel. It was a type of ship that was very maneuverable, small. Two of Columbus's ships were caravels, and all of Magellan's ships in 1517 were also caravels, and these were the ships that were used to explore the African coast. Now the Portuguese, as they went down the African coast, marked their trip with these monuments called pedraos. And some of these pedraos still exist. There may actually be one in the museum in Luanda, but I'm not certain about that. This one was, and they kept on setting these pedraos up to mark where they had been, and this one has an inscription on it. This one was erected in Angola, and it said in the era of 6681 years from creation, they're using an old calendar, of the world, 1482 years since the birth of our Lord Jesus, King Diogo II of Portugal sent Diogo Cao, squire of his house, to discover this land and place these pillars. And this they went, and this is a picture of them erecting these anywhere where they landed and they felt that it was important. Here is a map that shows the crosses, and this is everywhere that they had left, the Portuguese had left these pedraos. Only a few of them exist along the African coast, and I think they've all been taken in to various museums by now. When Columbus discovered American and claimed it for Spain, there was obviously a little bit of a tug of war between Spain and Portugal over who gets what. So they went to the Pope, and in 1494 the Pope divided the world between Spain and Portugal in the Treaty of Tordesillas. And everything here that is in the dark red, the purple, he gave to Portugal, and everything that was in the yellow went to Spain, which is why you've got South America, you've got Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country, and he gave pretty much all of Africa to the Portuguese. The Spaniards were not interested in Africa at the time, and they were thinking that they would get silver and gold in the Americas, and indeed when they got to Peru, they did find the silver mines of Potosi for Bolivia, and that's where they focused their energies. In the meantime, the Portuguese were left to explore Africa and to continue going around it, and Vasco da Gama finally made it around Africa, and he made it around Africa twice and ended up in Goa. And Goa in India today, to this day, many of the people have Portuguese names, and it was Christianized and it was brutalized. He wrote in his letter to the king of the conquest of Goa and how he actually imposed not only religion but the Portuguese system of government on that part of India. The Portuguese also ended up wanting to take over the Muslim routes across the Sahara. Here was this great camel trade going back and forth with gold and salt. And of course, they wanted to benefit from it. So they were going to get there, but the desert is so unique and it needs such an unusual amount of knowledge that it was not easy for anyone to conquer the peoples of the Sahara. They could disappear into the desert and evade their conquerors. So here was the gold trade, which we talked about before, and it was being controlled by the Kingdom of Ghana. This is not the same contiguous or the same outline of the country of Ghana today, but it's certainly a precursor of Ghana. It's the same people. And the Akan, the Ashanti that we talked about. And so the Portuguese decided that they were going to focus on that West African coast, and they were going to take a bite out of the gold trade that was then conducted across the Sahara and ended up in Egypt and ended up in the Middle East. Here are some of the caravans that went across the Sahara and the Hogar Mountains. This looks like it's in the mountains. They were taking gold, ivory, salt, cola nuts, and slaves. But the slavery, this type of slavery, was quite different from the slavery that later the Portuguese implemented into this region. This went to the markets, particularly the market in Cairo, and everything was distributed from there. There was no way the Portuguese could get to this Middle Eastern trade. The Ottomans had total control now of that trade to the east. So what the Portuguese could do was negotiate or conquer the Western peoples, the empires and kingdoms of Western Africa, and actually deal with them and compete with the Muslims who were trading over toward the east. Now, the West Africa was pretty much controlled by the Akan, various peoples of the Akan ethnic group, and they had different forms of government, but the Portuguese then decided that they would first start by making treaties, trade treaties. They never were going to move actual people into this area. They never settled the area. They had representatives and they had trade experts, they had traders and merchants, but they weren't really big on moving populations into the area. Now, Luanda is a slightly different situation. Here they did move people in, but in northern West Africa they did not. And so this was the beginning of what's called the Great Columbian Exchange. And here they started to deal with the locals. And how did they deal with the locals? The easiest way for the Portuguese to deal with the locals was to say, they realized that people were, they had borders they were fighting over. Everybody had tensions at borders, not just Europeans. And here they said, I will give you guns, and I will give you some Western goods, and you will bring me gold, and you will then bring me slaves as well, and you will capture them from the local population. And so they established these trading relationships that went back and forth across the Atlantic. But it was not easy. The locals did not want to trade, and they certainly did not want to get involved in trading slaves to the Europeans. And this is a part of history that you rarely read about. And it is a documented part of history that there was a tremendous resistance. And we know that also from the European indirect history, in that you have these castles, fortresses like Elmina and Cape Coast, built along the coastline. And what were they built for? They were built in order to hold slaves until they could get enough people to make it worthwhile for a European ship to pick them up, because it was not easy getting people for the slave trade. So the Portuguese, and then later the British came to compete and the French came to compete. They established a series of castles along the West African coast. Because it was so hard to get enough slaves to fill a ship, they had to hold people until they had enough people, and that's what these castles were for. And they had middlemen with whom they negotiated to then go out to the different kingdoms and negotiate the exchange of guns for slaves. And the guns then were used to expand the kingdoms and to solidify the borders of those kingdoms. And these colors show the major regions from where the slaves were taken from, especially earlier on by the Portuguese. And this shows the slave trader. Now this is Cape Coast Castle in Fortress. It's called castle, but it's a fortress really, in Ghana. And look at the picture. What do you see here? You see the guns are pointed toward the sea, not toward the land. So where is the enemy coming from? The enemy is not coming from land. They weren't afraid of the Africans. They were afraid of the other Europeans that would come and snatch their goods. The Europeans were fighting each other while they were causing havoc in the interior of West Africa as well. And if you get to go to this castle, take a look at it. Does this look like a warlike castle? No. It's an administrative castle. It's a fortress where the traders lived, and they protected their trading franchise from other Europeans. The Africans didn't attack them. They were never attacked by Africans. They were attacking each other. The French, the Dutch, and the Portuguese were constantly fighting. And there you see more of the cannon aimed at the sea. The interesting thing about this castle is that you can see something if you go there. You can see something that if you're not aware, you will miss. There is a door at the bottom here, a big wooden door, and it's unlocked. And if you go out that wooden door toward the sea, this is what you see. This is the local people. And I would say you wouldn't even know they're there. The way the tour goes through the castle, they don't show you that the castle is surrounded by local people, and you can see them for yourself and see how they live. And very interesting, the little flags, the flags from different countries. And I never went out into that area because we didn't have a lot of time, and it's kind of hard to get out into that area, but it would be interesting to find out. From the top of the castle, once you know they're there, you can get to one of the parapets and look down into the homes of the individual fishermen. And this is what you see. I mean, basically what you're seeing is abject poverty and a bare existence of the village shanties. Now in 1625, the West African area was a series of independent kingdoms. This is why the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Europeans could not penetrate into West Africa. These kingdoms defended themselves, and they weren't going to let those strangers from outside come in and ransack their homes. Even so, these colors represent the claims that the different European countries had, but they really had no control over these kingdoms. And these kingdoms resisted slavery, and this is the one thing you rarely read about, that there was a tremendous internal resistance in West Africa toward the slave trade, which is why it was so hard to get that enough slaves to fill a ship, why they had to build Cape Coast, and why they had to build the fortresses along the side. And these are the instances of the major resistance movements, There were others. And we have in 1656, we have our Queen Nzinga, the queen who sat in front of the captain of the Portuguese ship when he wanted her to stand in front of her, and she made a treaty with the Portuguese where none of her people were allowed to be enslaved, but in return she would deliver slaves from conquered peoples. And it's kind of a deal with the devil that they had to make. King Alfonso of the Congo, he actually tried to stop slaving. And the British and the Portuguese attacked his people and forced him to accept slavery. Dahomey, in 1777, Dahomey, which is now Benin, forbid slaving. King Agadia forbid slaving. And in came the British or the French or the Dutch and said, if you stop slaving, we'll demolish you, we'll reduce your kingdom to ashes. And so slaving ended up as a survival negotiation for most of these kingdoms. They were outgunned. Africa did not have the technology that the West had, and ever since the early medieval period, Europeans were honing their implements of war. Their technology was very much oriented toward warfare. King Alfonso, he totally refused slaving. And he refused to deliver. Let me read a piece of my notes. The Portuguese promised to train and educate the young men to become priests, and later to return them to the Congo. He's king of the Congo. And that is the kingdom that straddled Angola and southern Congo. And he let the Portuguese convince him to take a Christian name. He took the Christian name of Alfonso after the King of Portugal. And he wrote to the King of Portugal, his namesake, and he said, I do not believe in slavery. I do not want slavery. I want religion. I want education. I want all the things that you have, the way you have them. And the king said no. In the meantime, the Portuguese who came to this kingdom told them how life should be organized. And they created an upper class of dukes, marquis, all the counts, all of the kingdoms, and they educated them as to how a kingdom should really operate. Except with one exception, is that their kingdom had to pay with slaves, or they would be attacked. And they had no choice but to go along with it. Here's our Queen Nzinga sitting in front of the Portuguese on her servant. She refused to stand in front of him. She was considered an equal. She represented the Ngola, who was the leader of the people, her people, and that is the name that became Angola today. The Portuguese mistook the word Angola for the region, and Angola was actually a title of the ruler of that area. She herself became Angola when her brother died, and she negotiated with the Portuguese. She negotiated that she would take the name, I think it was Ana Sousa de Sousa, and in return, the Portuguese would not take her people as slaves, but they insisted that she deliver slaves at a certain rate in order to keep them from attacking her, and she did. And there is a picture, we don't have any pictures of her. The Europeans were absolutely terrified of the possibility that locals would eventually compete with them. And they did everything possible to dissuade any kind of economic activity. And this guy, Juboga, 1821, he was a slave. He got his freedom at the age of 12, and he had worked for an exporter of palm oil, and he eventually created one of the largest businesses in West Africa in palm oil exportation. The British did not want local competition, and so they kidnapped him and put him in jail. They sent him first, I believe he went to England, and then they sent him to the Cape Verdes where he died. But they, eventually it is said that they poisoned him because they were going to have no competition. And just as an aside, when in 1960-something the Congo became independent and the Belgians left the so-called Belgian Congo, they left behind not one single doctor in the country. Every single technician and doctor was taken away. And the same thing happened to all the other Portuguese, Sao Tome, the islands. They had produced cocoa and coffee. Not only did they take all of the engineers, but they destroyed all the equipment. So to this day, you go to the plantations and they're empty. They can't be rebuilt in any case. The Europeans weren't going to take any kind of competition at all. So by 1880, things in Europe had changed. Slaving had been forbidden, but it still went on. It went on as forced labor, particularly in the Belgian Congo. Leopold managed to get around the slaving prohibition. He said, well, these people are working for me voluntarily. This is a volunteer workforce. The fact that we don't pay them and that we remove their hands and feet if they don't really work, well, that's just an aside accident. Oops. So you have, at that time, in 1880, you have a series of independent kingdoms, and they're trying to survive and interact with the Europeans who are fighting among themselves for the riches of the Americas and the riches of Africa in order for local supremacy. The French, the British, the Dutch, the Spaniards, they're all fighting among each other in Europe, and those European wars are spilling over into the colonies. King Leopold, he was the cousin of Queen Victoria. They're all interrelated. All of those royals were interrelated. And he was king of a tiny little place, Belgium, that was a nothing place. And he wanted to compete with his cousin. So cleverly, he set up the Congo as his private corporation. And then he set up he got the rulers of the other European countries to divide Africa up so that he could legitimize his control over the Congo, and all the other Europeans would leave him alone. And so he set up what's called the conference that is the partition, the Berlin Conference in 1885, to partition Africa. And I think Kate talked about the partition of Africa. And he wasn't even there. He didn't go. He sent a representative. But all he wanted was the Congo, because the Congo has that river system, and the river system is part of a tropical forest, and the tropical forest produces rubber. And he saw rubber becoming the new gold of the world. And not only here, but in South America, the same thing was happening with Goodrich. Goodrich was taking over parts of the Amazon and bleeding the rubber. They're different species of trees. And so you get the mad scramble for Africa, which occurs up to the First World War, and Africa is divided. Not a single African was at the conference or consulted. It was simply, this is for you, this is for me. And this is how they divided it up. Now, of course, that was changed after the First World War. Southwest Africa, which was originally German, and Cameroon, which was German, was then given to other countries. Cameroon was given to France. Southwest Africa was given to South Africa as a protectorate. But the Belgian Congo remained what he called the Congo Free State, and it was a single corporation owned by Leopold II. Leopold actually was such an unpleasant individual that his wife left him, and his daughter wouldn't talk to him. So there was a little bit of a family problem there too. So this was a cartoon on the 1885 partition of Africa, which then, after World War I, led to changes in the map. But none of the Africans were involved in any of this mapping, nor was anybody concerned about which language people spoke on which side of the border. So if you look today, you say, I am going to Africa. This is an Africa voyage. Because we don't think of them as countries, because the Africans don't think of them as countries. We saw this earlier. These are the ethnic groups that are cut by the borders. Those borders are irrelevant to the locals. Those borders were imposed upon those countries. And they are political on an international level, but they're useless on the local level. But what all of that warfare has done is destabilized the original kingdoms that ruled various parts of Africa. And you caused mass migrations. And you see this red lines are people who are escaping various wars and various, and the fights are often between Europeans. They're not between Africans. They often use proxy Africans to fight the wars like they did with the Hutu and the Tutsi. And that was the British who did that. But this causes refugees to move toward the urban centers. And that causes a reduction in food production. In return, what did the Europeans introduce into Africa? They introduced what they called money. This is the money they introduced. Now, can you take this to France and buy a dress with it? Can you buy anything? Can you buy a piece of bread? And this is all money. And that was a specific policy in order to prevent exchanges between African economies and European economies. If you have a medium of trade, money, that does not work anywhere else in the world, you're isolating a population. And that was done on purpose. And cowrie shells. And cowrie shells come from Madagascar, and they were a form of exchange from probably centuries ago, and the Europeans continued to use them in the form of money. These ones down at the bottom with the holes in them, if you see them, you might want to acquire some. Those are juju. They are for good luck. And what you do is you take the cowrie shell and you put little things that are important to you inside of it, and that brings you good fortune. You can put herbs in there, you can put mementos in there, sort of like a locket. And this is something that is very nice to get. This manillas, another trade item, useless outside of Africa, totally useless, but a way of keeping them from interacting. In the meantime, the Europeans set up banks dealing with real money, but those were only accessible to the Europeans. This is the bank in Sierra Leone, Freetown in Sierra Leone, and there were banks in Luanda as well, but they were only for the Luandans. When I was in Benin, this guy was running for president, Yayi Boni, and he's got the cowrie shell there, which is a symbol of prosperity and good fortune. And you remember the birthers and the argument that Obama was not born in the United States. Yayi Boni, it's said, everybody said, was not born in Benin, even though he was running for president in Benin. And he said, "How do I know where I was born?" He says, "My mother died. I have no idea." In other words, who cares? That shows that those borders that were created are still considered artificial and not important to the local people. And so you've got the destabilization of Africa by these the slave trades and the meddling in the economy and meddling in the social life. Slaving is a major disruption in the way a society operates, and that was part of what the Europeans had intended. And what you have today is, instead of rubber, instead of gold, you have these resources coming out of Africa. Only they don't belong to the Africans, they belong to international corporations. And those corporations, they work within that political system that the locals don't acknowledge. They know where the border between Benin and Ghana and Togo is, whereas the locals say, "I don't care, my cousin's on the other side of the border, my mother's on this side of the border." it's all one society. Whereas these corporations have a whole different political system superimposed over the African system, and the Africans don't have a way of controlling it. And that is the challenge that is faced by them today, because they don't control their land and they don't control their economy. And in general, the African people in general are not very aggressive about their role in politics, because in the past, anytime they have gotten involved in politics, things didn't turn out well for them. So, thank you very much.